Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Adam Elwan from Communications here at the European Chemicals Agency, and I'm very glad to have you with us. Today's event is on the PFAS restriction, more specifically, on the ECHA Committee's opinions and next steps. Thank you for taking the time to join us. We know this is a topic of great interest, and we hope today's session will give you a clear and useful overview. So let's get started. We'll begin with the broader context, what the restriction proposal covers, where we are in the REACH process, and why this is an important stage. We'll then look at the main messages from the opinions of ECHA's two committees. First, the Risk Assessment Committee, or RAC, and then the Socio-Economic Analysis Committee, SEAC. We'll also explain what the consultation on the SEAC draft opinion covers and what kind of information we're looking for. Finally, we'll close with the next steps in the process before moving into the live Q&A. Here's how the session will run today. I'll start with this short welcome. Then, Roberto Scazzola, chair of ECHA's Risk Assessment Committee, presents an overview of RAC's opinion. After him, Maria Otati, who chairs the Socio-Economic Analysis Committee, will give an overview of SEAC's draft opinion. I'll then come back for some concluding remarks and the next steps in the process. After that, we'll move into the live Q&A. So please keep sending your questions throughout the event. Here's how the Q&A will run. You can join at slido.com and enter the event code PFAS26, or simply scan the QR code on the slide. You can send your questions throughout the event, and we'll answer as many as we can during the live Q&A from 11:40 to 12:40 Helsinki time. To help us manage the volume and keep the discussion focused, we'll answer questions that are within the scope of today's webinar. So the Q&A today is for questions on the main conclusions of RAC's final opinion, the key elements of SEAC's draft opinion, and what happens next in the process. Questions about the ongoing consultation on the SEAC draft opinion are outside the scope of today's session. This includes practical questions on how to respond to the consultation, such as the survey format, confidentiality, and how to submit information. Those topics were already covered in a previous webinar in October last year and in the published Q&A materials. You can access these from the link on this slide. If your question is about the consultation process, we'll point you to those existing materials. If your question falls outside the scope, we'll also let you know in Slido. If we don't get to your question during the live session, today's questions will be used to update our existing Q&A on PFAS and the restriction process where relevant, so you should find your answers there. And if you still need support afterwards, you can contact us through the ECHA contact form. All the materials from today will be made available on our website. You can already find the presentations on the event page, and the video recording will be watchable right after the event. So let's get started with the first presentation from Roberto, chair of our Risk Assessment Committee. Roberto, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Today, I will present the main conclusion of the Risk Assessment Committee, or RAC, on the proposed restriction of PFAS under REACH. RAC is the ECHA Scientific Committee on Risk Assessment with membership from over 50 European independent scientists and experts. PFAS stands for per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, so this is a very large group, and our task was to evaluate the restriction proposal submitted by 5 national authorities to ECHA. RAC assesses if PFAS pose risks to human health and the environment, and whether an EU-wide restriction is an appropriate way to address those risks. Let me be clear, this has been a major piece of work for the committee with around 3 years of assessment and discussion involving committee members, ECHA experts, member states, and many stakeholders. The conclusion of the committee is clear. PFAS can pose growing risks to people and the environment, and further EU-wide regulatory action is needed to control those risks. RAC did not work in isolation. The dossier submitters, composed by 5 countries' proposal, was open for comments for a 6-month consultation that was carried out at the start of the process. We had a record high input from European citizens, civil society, economic operators, and others. The received input has been carefully assessed, first by the dossier submitters, the review of the original proposal, what we call the background document, and then was reviewed by RAC. Let me be clear once more. Each single contribution out of the 5,600 plus comments has been looked and assessed by RAC. This has been a tremendous work, and this is why it took so long to conclude. This, on the other hand, has been also very useful to make RAC opinion better, updated, and more complete. The outcome of the RAC assessment of the consultation is also available on our website for full transparency. So let's move into the assessment. Firstly, the dossier submitter considered PFAS pollution a serious issue deserving a new coordinated action. The starting point for RAC's assessment is the very persistent nature of PFAS. Once these substances are released into the environment, they remain there for a very long time. That persistence is the key driver for concern. In addition, many PFAS have other hazardous properties that increase concerns for both human health and the environment, including severe hazards such as carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicity, just to quote some of them. The committee considered evidence showing that PFAS can move through environmental media and also build up or increase stock over time. Some studies even showed that PFAS can reach the blood of workers and accumulate over time. So, the very persistent properties of PFAS, in combination with other hazards, although not homogeneous, is the main driver for regulatory action. They have been also called sort of forever pollutants exactly for those reasons. So this means that emissions today create a problem for future generations that remains with us for a very long time. A key issue in this proposal is the substance identity. All relevant actors must know what is in the scope of the restriction and what is not. RAC supports, therefore, the use of the broad OECD definition for PFAS. In practice, this means covering chemicals that contain at least one fully fluorinated CF2, CF3 group, so carbon-fluorine bond, that, by the way, is among the most stable bonds known in chemistry. Why is that broad definition of PFAS important? Because if the definition is too narrow, one harmful PFAS may simply be replaced by another very similar PFAS with the same properties of concern. RAC agreed, therefore, that with the broad grouping approach, exactly to avoid that kind of substitution. The dossier submitter also considered excluding some subgroups linked to possible degradability. However, RAC did not find sufficient evidence to support that exclusion. So for this case, we retain the broad OECD definition. RAC recommended, in addition, treating PFAS in this restriction as non-threshold substances. In simple terms, this means there is no safe level of release into the environment. Any emission can add to the current concern and contribute to risk. This approach also reflects the fact that because PFAS are so persistent, they accumulate over time. So, the greater the emissions, the greater the stock in the environment, and therefore the greater the long-term risk. The RAC opinion takes the view that any release matters. This is also consistent with approaches that RAC has used in the past, in other cases, involving very persistent and bioaccumulative substances. It is important to say, however, that decision makers or our sister committee SEAC may also consider other relevant elements beyond the scientific risk assessment, such as socioeconomic considerations that are out of the scope of RAC. Two important categories discussed in the opinion are also fluoropolymers and volatile PFAS, including fluorinated gases. Fluoropolymers are plastics made from monomers containing strong carbon-fluorine bonds, typical of PFAS. Their uses are, for instance, coating, cookware, sealants, and others. They are extremely stable and resistant to heat, friction, and chemicals, and other relevant properties. RAC recognized that fluoropolymers are generally not mobile or bioaccumulative in the same way as some other PFAS. However, the committee identified important concerns linked to their life cycle. PFAS are emitted during their production, and also additional PFAS may also be formed or released at the waste stage, for example, during incineration or disposal, micro and nano-sized polymer particles may also be formed during use and disposal of waste. The other category, so for volatile PFAS, especially fluorinated gases, the concern is a little bit different. Their use is very common in refrigeration, climatization, and similar uses. These substances, if not controlled, can evaporate, reach the atmosphere, and travel long distances and contribute to the widespread pollution, even in very remote areas such as Arctic regions, mountains. Some also have global warming potential, so they can actively contribute to climate change effects. And many degrade into other PFAS, such as trifluoroacetic acid, or TFA, that, by the way, is also currently under scrutiny by RAC as well, in terms of its classification and hazard properties. So, overall, RAC considered these concerns for fluoropolymers and volatile PFAS as serious, and could not therefore support their exclusion from the scope of the restriction, as was initially requested by some stakeholders. RAC also looked at the scale of PFAS use and emissions in Europe. The main uses refer to the 14 sectors covered in the dossier submitter's initial restriction proposal, such as consumer applications, transport and construction, electronics, and others. Based on the available information, the committee estimated that in the year 2020, about 270,000 tons of PFAS were in use in the European Economic Area. Quite big volumes, showing the widespread use of PFAS in many sectors. The three biggest uses identified were textile, upholstery, leather, and similar uses, but also fluorinated gases and transport. RAC also estimated emissions, so how much of the volumes used are actually released into the environment when producing, using, and disposing PFAS. This estimation was about 70,000 tons per year. However, RAC also noted a higher level of uncertainty for this estimate compared to volumes. Following the 6 months consultation on the dossier submitter's initial restriction proposal, 8 additional sectors were identified and included in the updated dossier submitter's proposal in June last year. Due to time constraints, RAC could not perform the same level of sector evaluation as it was done initially for the 14 sectors plus the PFAS manufacturing. There is also a communication that ECHA issued last August exactly on this point, where you can find more details. However, the committee did refer to the estimates provided by the dossier submitter and considered that the proposed risk management measures could also be applied to them. This will allow decision makers to take those into account when considering further action. From a risk reduction perspective, RAC concluded that a restriction on the manufacture, use, and placing on the market of PFAS is the most effective measure. So reducing or stopping altogether emission into the environment is considered the best way to reduce or stop the risks. Since these substances are treated as non-threshold, as I mentioned earlier, in the committee's evaluation, reducing emissions as much as possible is the best way to reduce risk. And also for the same reasons, the derogations proposed by the dossier submitter were generally not supported by RAC, with a few notable exceptions. One example mentioned in the assessment relates to certain protective equipment and where removing PFAS could reduce their performance and create severe health and safety concerns for workers. Overall, RAC estimated that a full restriction could avoid around 3 million tons of PFAS emissions over a period of 30 years, even acknowledging, of course, the uncertainties in the same analysis. This is a very important point for RAC, considering the likelihood that certain uses of PFAS may continue for some time. RAC therefore underlined that if derogations are granted for specific uses, additional risk management measures should be taken to minimize PFAS emissions into the environment. There are 4 main types of measures I would like to describe that were recommended by RAC. So the first one is about supply chain communication on PFAS uses. So you basically need to know and inform your customers about the use of PFAS in a product, otherwise you cannot act. The second set of measures relate to clear consumer labeling on safe use and disposal. So we want to inform and instruct consumers and professionals on how to handle and dispose PFAS or PFAS-containing products safely. Third, monitor emission and report to ECHA. So those are measures to assess how effective are the measures to reduce the PFAS emissions into the environment. Only if you monitor, you can know what is actually happening. And finally, site-specific PFAS management plans for manufacturers and industrial users. So you need to know the PFAS uses in your industry and put in place measures to reduce their releases. When it goes to enforcement, a very important point, RAC highlighted the importance of harmonized implementation of the proposed restriction across the European Union. And the committee took also note of the forum's opinion on enforceability and agreed that standardized analytical methods for sampling and analysis will be essential to make the restriction work in practice. So, coming to an end, to conclude, RAC message is that PFAS are a serious long-term concern and EU-wide action is needed. If derogations are allowed, emissions still need to be minimized as much as possible via the 4 main types of recommended risk management measures that we just described. So thank you for listening. I hope I was able to convey the tremendous amount of work supporting this restriction proposal and also the main conclusion and scientific basis of RAC's final opinion. I look forward to answering your questions during the Q&A, and I'm happy to hand over to Maria to cover the SEAC part. Thank you very much.
Good morning. In this part of the webinar, I will explain the main points of the draft opinion of the Committee for Socio-Economic Analysis, or SEAC, on the proposed restriction of PFAS. SEAC's role is different from RAC's. RAC looks at the risks to human health and the environment. SEAC takes that risk assessment into account, but then looks at the broader socioeconomic picture. Our task is to assess the cost and benefits of the proposed restriction. We weigh the benefits of reducing risk to health and the environment against the negative societal impacts of restricting the use of PFAS. By doing that, we advise on whether the proposed restriction is a proportionate measure. SEAC identifies what will happen if the proposed restriction enters into force and what the consequences of that are likely to be. SEAC assesses cost and benefits for all actors affected by the proposed restriction. The benefits of restricting a substance are typically related to human health or the environment. Regarding the costs, it's important first of all to note that they're not limited to cost to business. The impacts of the proposed restriction considered include those to companies making use of PFAS, but they also include the impacts on consumers, the public, and also to companies offering alternatives to PFAS. The costs to society are often dependent on the availability of alternatives. If suitable alternatives are available when the restriction enters into force, there may still be some cost, for example, from switching to the alternatives, but overall, the negative impacts are likely to be smaller. But if alternatives are not available, or if they perform much worse than PFAS, the negative impacts are likely to be larger. These consequences can vary greatly depending on what the affected companies do. For example, at entry into force, companies may implement underperforming alternatives, leading to reduced article performance and potential negative impacts on the consumers using them. If they can't substitute at all, on the other hand, they may discontinue production, leading to reduced profits, negative impacts for consumers, and possible supply chain disruptions. There can also be wider environmental impacts, for example, if the absence of PFAS affects technologies linked to climate or energy performance. The overall conclusion of SEAC's draft opinion is that we support a broad restriction on PFAS with use-specific derogations in the cases where the costs to society outweigh the benefits. In other words, we consider that some derogations are needed to ensure that the proposed restriction remains proportionate. There were, however, several elements from the proposal made by the dossier submitter that SEAC either does not agree with or cannot conclude on. These are detailed throughout the draft opinion. SEAC has assessed whether derogations are justified on a use-by-use basis. When considering whether a derogation may be justified, SEAC has taken into account the availability of alternatives for the use in question, the emissions associated with the continued use, and the possible socioeconomic impacts in case the use would be restricted. The level of evidence and the uncertainties are important elements when assessing the need for derogations. For example, when the technical requirements for the use in question have been defined, possible alternatives have been identified, and there is evidence on how these alternatives meet the technical requirements, SEAC is more likely to be able to conclude confidently both on the substitution potential and on the need for a derogation. However, in cases where SEAC has insufficient information on when there is conflicting evidence and the conflicts cannot be explained and reconciled, SEACs will likely make less firm conclusions, or it may not be able to conclude at all on the need for a derogation. You will see that the level of evidence and the uncertainties are reflected in how SEAC has worded its conclusions on the derogations in a draft opinion. The conclusion may be that a derogation is justified, likely justified, partly justified, not justified, or even that a conclusion is not possible. Another important issue is how long derogations should last when they are justified. The general aim basically is to allow enough time for a transition away from PFAS, while avoiding, of course, unnecessary delays in reducing emissions. In the proposal, the dossier submitter proposed certain time and limited derogations, for example, for active substances in biocidal products, for plant protection products, and for medicinal products. The majority of the derogation proposed, however, are time-limited. Now, for the time-limited derogations, the dossier submitter used a broad approach with two general derogation periods, 5 years and 12 years, and these are, of course, on top of the general 18-month transition period. The first case, 5 years, that was proposed where alternatives had been identified or whether, where some progress had been made, but more time would still be needed to implement them fully. On the other hand, 12 years was proposed where no technically and economically feasible alternatives had yet been identified, or where, for example, certifications or regulatory approvals were expected to take longer. In general, SEAC supported this overall approach from the dossier submitter, even while noting that these periods have been chosen rather arbitrarily and they are not tailored use by use. However, in a restriction of this scale, SEAC accepted that this kind of pragmatic structure was appropriate. Based on the evaluation, SEAC concluded that there are various uses where alternatives already exist, and the socioeconomic analysis of the proposed restriction indicates that derogations are not needed. But there are also uses where the evidence indicates that derogations are justified. For example, where the performance and safety requirements are very strict, or where there is evidence that the socioeconomic implications of restricting the use would be significant. You will find SEAC's conclusions on the derogation proposed by the dossier submitter in Table 9 of the SEAC draft opinion, while the additional derogations considered by SEAC are presented in Table 10 of the same document. The background and justifications for these conclusions are given in the relevant part of the opinion, including in the sector-specific evaluations. So the concise summaries in the table must be read alongside the more detailed assessment in the opinion to get the full picture. It is important to note as well that SEAC cannot exclude that additional derogations may still be needed for certain uses so that the restriction can be proportionate. However, uncertainties in the available information on the assessed uses, as well as on any identified uses, prevent SEAC from specifying such additional derogations. Of course, if sufficient substantiating information is received during the consultation, SEAC could be able to identify others. As Roberto has explained, RAC recommends additional risk management measures for derogated uses so that PFAS emissions can be minimized. SEAC, in principle, supports introducing additional risk management. However, SEAC does not have information to assess the cost and benefits of those specific measures that are proposed by RAC, and therefore it cannot conclude whether they are proportionate. Furthermore, SEAC has some concerns about the enforceability of some of these specific measures. And although the committee considers that the concerns could be mitigated by developing appropriate guidance, those concerns are noted. The 8 sectors for which analysis was added to the proposal by the dossier submitter after the 6-month consultation have not been evaluated in detail by SEAC. Because of this, SEAC cannot conclude whether the derogations proposed by the dossier submitter for the specific uses within the scope of these sectors are justified. It also cannot conclude if additional derogations for other uses within these sectors would be warranted. SEAC recommends that all uses in these 8 sectors are evaluated as soon as possible. Until this evaluation is completed and a well-informed decision on proportionality can be made, the committee recommends a time-limited derogation for all uses within these sectors. SEAC considers the restriction, including appropriate derogations, to be implementable, manageable, and enforceable, although it notes that some specific provisions may be more difficult to enforce. The committee stresses that clear guidance for all stakeholders needing to comply with the proposed restriction would help to address enforcement challenges. A practical, harmonized enforcement approach at EU level is also considered crucial to ensure enforceability. The consultation on the SEAC draft opinion opened on the 26th of March and runs for 60 days, closing on the 25th of May. It focuses on the draft opinion agreed in March and covers all 23 sector assessments and the uses within them. There are detailed questions for the sectors that SEAC has evaluated in detail and more general possibilities to provide information on the sectors that were not assessed in the same way. The consultation is being carried out in a structured survey format. There are no attachments allowed, so respondents need to provide their information directly in the format requested. Guidance, previous webinar material, and also a mapping of PFAS uses are available to help respondents prepared. More importantly, I should note that we're looking for technical, evidence-based information. This is not about whether someone likes or dislikes the proposal. What matters is the information that can be substantiated and that can help SEAC confirm or, where necessary, revise its conclusions. The next step after that is for SEAC to analyze the information received in the consultation. We will examine whether the new information supports the conclusions in the draft opinion or whether changes are needed. The current plan is for SEAC to adopt its final opinion by the end of 2026, and ECHA will send it, together with the RAC final opinion, to the European Commission. After that, the Commission, together with the Member States, will decide on the final form of the restriction. So my closing message is this. The draft opinion is an important milestone, but it is not the end of the process. The consultation is a key opportunity for stakeholders to provide relevant evidence and help strengthen the final opinion. Thank you, and I hope this has clarified the main messages of SEAC's draft opinion and the importance of the consultation phase.
Thank you, Maria. With that, we've come to the end of the presentations. I'll now wrap up the main conclusions from today before we start the live Q&A. So, to conclude, today's webinar has shown you why PFAS are such a significant regulatory concern. They're a very large group of substances, they're highly persistent, and their emissions can create long-term risks for both people and the environment. We've also heard that RAC considers an EU-wide restriction on the manufacture, use, and placing on the market of PFAS to be the most effective risk reduction measure. RAC's message is also clear: where derogations are allowed, emissions should still be minimized as much as possible through specific risk management measures. From the socioeconomic side, SEAC supports the proposed restriction, together with targeted derogations where these are justified by the available evidence. The aim is to ensure that the restriction addresses the identified risks while remaining proportionate and considering socioeconomic impacts and the availability of alternatives. So overall, both committees support EU-wide action on PFAS, and the process now moves on to the next stage, finalizing SEAC's opinion and then moving to decision-making by the European Commission together with the Member States. Here's a timeline of the restriction process, starting from the submission of the proposal in January 2023. So we're now at step 5. The immediate next step is that stakeholders can continue to send information through the consultation on SEAC's draft opinion. That input will then be reviewed by SEAC as part of its final assessment. Based on the evidence received, the committee may confirm or revise elements of its draft opinion before adopting the final opinion. The current plan is for that to happen by the end of 2026. Once the committee's work is complete, ECHA will submit the opinions to the European Commission. The Commission will then take the process forward together with the member states, who decide on the final restriction. So in short, we're now moving from the scientific evaluation phase towards the finalization of the opinions and then into the legislative decision-making stage. Now it's time to start our live Q&A. As mentioned at the start, you can send us questions through Slido using the QR code on the slide or by going to slido.com and using the event code PFAS26. The live Q&A lasts until 12:40 Helsinki time. After that, we will end the webinar. Remember that if your question is not answered by the end of the event, we'll update the existing Q&A on the restriction. And if you need to contact us, use our contact form at echa.europa.eu/contact. So, once again, many thanks to all of you for joining us today and to our presenters. I'll now hand over the floor to Mercedes, who will be moderating the Q&A, and Roberto and Maria, who are here to reply to your questions. We'll start shortly.
Hello, welcome to this info session. I am Mercedes Márquez Camacho. I am team leader at the European Chemicals Agency, and I coordinate the work on the PFAS restriction. Today, in our live panel, we have Roberto and Maria. You have already met them in the previous presentations. Roberto is the chair of the Risk Assessment Committee, and Maria is the chair of the Socio-Economic Analysis Committee. Welcome, Roberto and Maria, to this live session. Thank you very much to all of you who have submitted questions in advance. We have many questions, so we will try to answer as many as possible in the live session, but keep in mind that you can still submit questions until the end of the event. We will prioritize those questions that are most popular, so the ones with the highest number of votes will be answered first. And keep in mind that the focus of the webinar is the RAC opinion and the SEAC draft opinion. So with this, we can start with the questions. I will go for the first one. I will first read the question and we'll let you know, Maria and Roberto, who will be the first one to go, but please feel free to interrupt each other or complement if needed. 8 additional sectors have not been fully assessed by SEAC so far. Will the European Commission forecast a public consultation to gather complementary data?
Well, that will depend on the manner in which they deal with the assessment in this sector. So, if an assessment is done, there are different ways of doing it. And depending on what they choose, then that will depend on whether a consultation is done. Of course, if we in the committees are tasked with this, and it goes through the usual processes, one might expect that there would be consultations, but it's not something that we can tell don't know if Roberto, you want to complement with something on that.
No, I think you're right. And as you mentioned, RAC, for instance, did not assess the volumes and emissions of the 8 additional sectors, but there were information provided by the dossier submitters. And these will be part of the opinions that will be sent to the European Commission, and they will discuss with member states the way forward. So, and we will adapt accordingly. So I think, Maria, you covered it well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's go with the next question. This one is for you, Roberto. If a customer claims his product doesn't have PFAS, what type of evidence needs to be provided according to ECHA?
Well, that's a quite good question, and I think it applies in general to any restrictions. So the moment the ECHA opinion is provided to the European Commission, this can become actually a European law in a regulation, and their specific requirements are needed. And usually a restriction, like in the case of PFAS, provides limit values above which the restriction applies, and below them it doesn't apply. So that first evidence, so to check whether the substances that are considered to be PFAS fulfill the definition, and then you will have to assess whether their concentration is above the limits. In the case of PFAS, there are 3 different limits related to target analysis or total fluorine content, and the opinion is quite explicit into this. So I would say this is the entry point. Consider the definition and then the limit values.
Thank you very much, Roberto. We move now to a question for you, Maria. Why were laboratory and analytical instruments not assessed separately, although REACH defines scientific research and development broadly, including analysis? And a follow-up question here, how will SEAC ensure that professional laboratory uses across sectors, including the supply chain, are fully covered?
Thanks, Mercedes. I think with this one, it may be useful to go a little bit back to the fundamentals and explain how it works with restrictions. So with restrictions, what ECHA committees are doing is assessing a proposal that is made by what we call the dossier submitter. In this case, the dossier submitter are 5 countries who put together this proposal, and they are the ones who structured it, decided how the sectors were defined, what goes where. In this case, the dossier submitter, that's a little bit of jargon in the way we refer to them, has basically assumed that diagnostic laboratory testing is covered by the exemption from REACH that we call the SR&D, so scientific research and development. Now, we understand in RAC and SEAC that there are some uncertainties about that. So we have raised that in the opinions that in some cases, some may not be covered. So when it comes to making sure that things are covered, what you can do is to provide information in the consultation substantiating the concerns that SEAC has and RAC has, or information that is, contradicting it as well. So we'd be very interested to know how you see this, so that we can solidify our conclusions in SEAC. That's it for me.
Thank you, Maria. We move on to the next question. Here, this is a question for you, Maria, as well. It says that now I'm a little bit lost in my question. I will take this one. Will the European Commission publish guidelines on methods for analyzing PFAS to meet the threshold set out in this restriction? Sorry, I'm laughing because the questions are moving on as people are voting there.
Yeah, there is great interest, Mercedes. I think it's a measure of the success of this initiative, of the interest at least.
Okay, now I will repeat the question more seriously. Will the European Commission publish guidelines on methods for analyzing PFAS to meet the thresholds set out in this restriction? Well, I said Maria, but maybe Roberto, you can start first and then Maria complement. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I think this is a very important point because it allows all economic operators to understand whether they are within or not the scope of the restriction. And as mentioned, you have to look first at the substances, and there is a very broad definition, and then you have thresholds. We also benefited from the opinion of Forum, that is actually the meeting putting together the enforcement authorities, and they pointed out that there are not full analytical methods available for all possible PFAS. So that's definitely an area where we need to improve. Also, the RAC opinion points out that we need to progress into this area because there are standard analytical methods for some PFASs, but not for all of them. So it will be important that there will be definitely a progress in terms of the methodology analysis, but also in the way you will perform the sampling and the testing. So I think guidelines will be probably needed. Of course, it's something that the European Commission, in close consultation with member states, will have to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Maria, do you want to add something here, or we move to the next question?
No, I think that's been covered enough by Roberto. Thank you.
Okay. So the next question is for you, Maria. SEAC acknowledges that not all PFAS uses have been identified and properly assessed. How does ECHA plan to address sectors that have formally communicated a missing use status, such as the biopharma manufacturing and life science supply industry, but were still not evaluated in the draft opinion?
Yeah, with such a broad restriction as this one, it's impossible to have every single use covered. So that's always going to be the case. It's impossible to have a specific analysis on every single use. Now, in terms of missing use, I'm not quite sure what is meant here, but I guess it could mean different things, whether it's not something that's been specifically analyzed by the dossier submitted in the proposal, or it could be something that is covered within the famous 8 sectors where there is an assessment by the dossier submitter and the committees haven't done an evaluation. So if it's the first where there isn't, these are uses that are covered within that fall within the sectors that have been addressed by the committees and haven't been addressed specifically, information should be submitted in the consultation. And if sufficient information is provided there, the committees will assess it and come to conclusions there. When it comes to areas that would fall within these 8 sectors, then this is something that is part of what we discussed earlier about a recommendation that analysis is done and a formal assessment is done of these 8 sectors as soon as possible.
Thank you very much, Maria. I move on to the next question, which is also for you, Maria. So take a breath because I have 2 or 3 questions more for you in a row. So this one reads, recommending time-limited derogations for non-assessed sectors creates huge regulatory uncertainties and major business risks. It's an unbalanced approach, especially when evidences are available that some critical uses are a threat, for example, medicinal products. Patient access is at real risk here. Can you say something about this, Maria?
Well, what I can say is that this is why SEAC is recommending that a proper analysis is done of these sectors as soon as possible. So that's a decision that is not temporary or interim can be taken. We do understand this, but we had to, in our decision as to, how to do our analysis, we had to balance being able to provide a timely analysis and making sure that our analysis comes out while the evidence that is underpinning it is still timely, and being able to cover everything that was in the dossier. And it was a difficult decision, but this is where we ended up.
And a new question, but very much related with what you say. This reads, on the 8 additional sectors, ECHA's presentation states, SEAC recommends all uses in these 8 sectors be evaluated as soon as possible. And here the question is very concrete. How, when, and by whom?
Yeah, I'm afraid on that one, I can't add anything more. That we are recommending to the decision makers that this is done. But it's up to them to decide amongst the many different options that they have. And it's not something that we can predict here. It will be up to them. We hope, what we can say is that we ask for this to be done as soon as possible. So in terms of the time, we give a very clear signal, but it's up to them to decide how and by who.
Thank you very much. And another one for you, Maria. SEAC proposes an exemption for strings of musical instruments, but not a general one for life-saving medical devices and medicinal products. How can this be justified socioeconomically?
Yeah, SEAC is not saying that one particular sector is more important than others because derogation is proposed here. We're looking at each one in isolation, looking at all the different elements that come into a decision about whether a derogation should be proposed. And there we're talking about the potential impacts of derogation not being there, both in terms of the socioeconomic impacts, but then also on the emissions that would result. And obviously the emissions are quite different there as well. That's one of the reasons. But we are absolutely not saying that musical instruments are more important in some way than medical devices.
Thank you very much, Maria. Now we are moving to Roberto with a question on F-gases, but of course, Maria, if you can also complement, that will be very welcome. So, Roberto, why is it planned to further restrict F-gases as PFAS, where F-gases are already regulated and step-by-step phased out in chillers, refrigerators, and so on, according to the regulation on the F-gases?
Thank you, Mercedes. I think it's a very good question that also highlights the interrelationship between different regulations. And it's the short answer, it's a matter of a scope. The scope of the fluorinated gases regulation is to target certain uses of F-gases that could also trigger specific effects under the climate change and similar effects, while the PFAS restriction entry point is the persistency associated with other potential hazards. Therefore, the scope of the PFAS restriction is definitely broader. And this means that there might be an interrelationship, but the PFAS restriction includes more substances than the ones covered by the fluorinated gases. And the fluorinated gases regulation does not take into account the environmental effects that are actually looked at by the restriction. So what is interesting is that this part has been explained. It's a quite complex issue, and there will be an interrelationship. And this also means that F-gases regulation will also have some beneficial effects. And this has been taken into account, and probably Maria can complement on that part.
Yeah, I can say that SEAC, this is something that we looked into in quite a lot of detail, trying to understand what the overlaps were. And we have a specific concern on making sure that there isn't double regulation as well. So there are quite detailed conclusions there about where we can say that things are overlapping between the two regulations, and making some proposals about what the decision makers should take into account there.
Thank you very much to both of you, Roberto and Maria. The next one is also to both of you. How will the entry of PFAS-containing products from outside the EU, potentially banned in certain uses, be controlled to ensure fair competition with EU companies complying with regulations? Well, maybe Maria, you can start, and Roberto complement if needed. Thank you.
Yeah, so basically restrictions cover imported products. So one of the good elements of restrictions are that imported products are covered. I think that's what we can say there. I don't know if Roberto, you want to add something more.
Yeah, no, I think it's correct. It definitely applies. There is a matter also of enforcement, and this is a general issue with all restrictions. And this is why our process entails also to consult the forum that I have already mentioned, so the competent authorities in charge for enforcement, because I mean, any restriction or legal act that will restrict the availability on the market of certain that will allow this to work. So I think we took this into account, and definitely considering also the way the market is evolving, is a quite important topic, and I'm sure the European Commission and member states will also elaborate on that point.
Okay, let's move to the next question. This is for you, Maria. Will the SEAC consider the current EU regulations of circular economy? The majority of products have a use life of more than 20 years, meaning if approved, we will have unnecessary waste impacting directly the principles of circular economy.
Yeah, I think what I can say there is that when we're talking about socioeconomic impacts, we're talking about things quite broadly. So we are also noting these impacts on potential impacts on circular economy and so on. We're also looking at other aspects a bit more horizontally, such as, for instance, spare parts and things like that, to ensure that there isn't unnecessary waste. So these are aspects that are considered, whether in some cases, particularly in the sector-specific parts of the opinion, or in the more general parts of the opinion across the board for all the sectors. So this is something that is, of course, a concern and something that we aim to flag to the decision maker as well, that there could be impacts on circular economy.
Thank you, Maria. And the next one is also for you. This relates with what we have been discussing before about the lack of conclusions from SEAC. What is the follow-up process if SEAC cannot conclude whether a derogation is justified and SEAC cannot provide further points for the decision maker's consideration? Who will take over the task and fill the assessment gap between SEAC assessment and filing a regulation?
Well, the first thing to say is that what we hope is that the consultation will allow us to resolve some of these points where we are not able to either conclude firmly or to come up with more elements that the decision maker can take. But there will be some cases where it's going to have to be a decision that is made by the decision maker based on the elements that are there. So not fully based on the scientific elements, because they're simply not there. I think this is a reality of restriction that is as broad as this one, that in some cases it's not going to be ideal in terms of info. But we really encourage people to provide the information so that the conclusions can be as firm as possible. We are trying very hard to make sure that it's clear what is the reason why SEAC cannot conclude. Is it because there is information that is contradicting each other? Is it because we don't have any information at all? So that should give you some information for those of you who have data on a particular use to provide it, so that we're able to solidify the conclusions. But at the same time, for us, it's very important that we don't push conclusions to a point where data is not supporting them, and the evidence is not supporting it. It's very important for the transparency of the opinions of the committee that we stop where the evidence is stopping. So we do understand that then this puts the decision makers in a harder position, but we have to be honest about what's there and what isn't. But hopefully the number of these will diminish vastly after the consultation.
Thank you very much, Maria. Very clear answer, I think. Well, let's move to the next question. Maybe you can start, Roberto, and Maria complement. It reads, will the EU PFAS restriction apply to imported goods and intermediate products containing PFAS? Roberto.
Yes, thank you, Mercedes. I think we partially already covered this aspect. So in principle, EU restrictions under REACH do also cover the indeed imported goods, because it's based on the concept of placing on the market. So if you're basically importing a good and placing on the European market, you will be subject actually to the scope of the restriction. That's my understanding, but Maria might know more.
No, I don't think I can add anything more to that. I think that's about it, yeah.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Yes, I think it was very clear from your answer. We move on to the next question. This is for Maria. Does SEAC foresee differentiated treatment for fluoropolymers such as PTFE used in durable industrial applications?
Let me think about this one, because this is one that's just trying to remember. It's a very big opinion. So yeah, I think that in this one, we would apply the usual approach, basically, of looking at the analysis of alternatives and the socioeconomic impacts. When it comes to durable versus non-durable, obviously the impacts that are resulting from this would be assessed in the usual way. So I wouldn't see that we would treat it in a different way. We would simply consider the different impacts in the way that we have done so for all the areas.
Thank you, Maria. I will move to the next question, which relates with the 8 sectors that we were discussing in previous questions. Here it says, what is expected for the 8 sectors left aside in the draft assessment? Sealing applications, other medical applications, broader industrial uses. Will these sectors be considered in the final conclusions? I think, Maria, this is for you. Please go
Yes,
ahead.
I can take this one. So when it comes to detailed conclusions on things like availability of alternative costs, benefits, information that is coming on the 8 sectors will not be used to come to conclusions there. I think there we will not assess them in detail. But if there is information that relates to this that is more relevant to more horizontal topics, for instance, information about the impact of RMMs in those sectors and things like that, then of course that information will be taken into account. But what we can tell you is that all information received will be kept, of course, and will be there in the whole package that is transmitted to the decision makers and will be able to be used at the point when a further assessment is done.
Thank you, Maria. Well, one follow-up question for Roberto. I understand that for these 8 new sectors, RAC recommends in case that there is continued use, there will be also risk management measures to be applied. Am I correct in my question?
Yes, thank you, Mercedes, for pointing out this. I think that's a very important point. As you know, the analysis of alternatives, it's definitely a matter for SEAC. What RAC could conclude, however, was that in case derogations will be granted by the decision maker, proposed RAC considered that additional risk management measures should be applied to reduce the uncontrolled release into the environment of PFAS. And those have been described, I think, in the opinion, in the presentation that we made earlier. I think I made those points. They include, for instance, a PFAS management plan for in case you manufacture PFAS, but also supply chain communication, but also information to the users, to the consumers and professionals on how to correctly dispose. We think that those package of measures could really reduce the amount of PFAS that are released into the environment and somewhat also counterbalance the possible derogation because the decision maker might decide that they don't want to restrict certain uses. So I think that would be a fair approach.
Thank you very much, Roberto. I move on to the next question, and this relates to the definition of the sectors. Maybe we can start with you, Roberto, again. Can the rationale be shared how sectors were defined, selected, and prioritized for assessment and derogations? Well, of course, Maria, you can complement.
Yeah,
Please,
maybe I can simply start and then Maria steps in. We are bound by a proposal made by what we call dossier submitters. In this case, there have been 5 countries that they have worked together to make this possible. And so that proposal tried to group, since it's a very broad proposal with a lot, and basically RAC and I suppose SEAC has also worked using the same approach to allow this possibility. But I don't know, Maria, please.
Yeah, I think what I can say is that the way that the sectors were defined was based in the information and evidence that they received during the numerous call for evidence that were done by the dossier submitted during the preparation of the restriction. So to an extent, the way things were defined was based on the information that they received and that they were able to gather. It was a huge effort on their part and quite a lot of work. Now, obviously, the way you define sectors in the end can be a little bit arbitrary. And we have seen that there is a lot of questions about does this use fit here in the sector, that sector, lots of disagreements that a sector should have been done for this, a sector should have been done for that. But it's not an obvious way in which way the sectors have been done. I mean, at some point they made a decision about how to do that. We understand that there are still some questions about whether things fall where, and what we've done is some sector use mapping that is available within the consultation materials that we hope helps guide you into where things are. And yes, we understand that people may have their disagreements about how it was defined, but that's the dossier submitter's decision about how to structure the analysis in a way that makes the most sense. And that's what the committees have been working with as Roberto.
Thank you very much to both of you. I'm going to ask you again, Maria, about one of the previous questions. It seems that the audio was not very, very good, and I will ask you again, and also Roberto, if you want to complement, okay? So here we go again. SEAC recommends all uses in the 8 new sectors to be evaluated as soon as possible. Until evaluation is completed, SEAC recommends a time-limited derogation for all users within these sectors. When can clarity be expected on whether, and if so when, these 8 new sectors will undergo evaluation? We have answered some similar questions, but if you could address this again, that will be very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I said was that we expect to adopt the SEAC final opinion by the end of the year. And then at that point, this will be sent to the decision maker. So basically, the Commission will make a decision on the restriction together with the member states. So it's them that will make a decision about this. So what SEAC has recommended is that this assessment is done as soon as possible. That's what we're asking for. But the final decision as to how, when, by whom, I think that's what the other question that we had on the topic was asking about. That is a decision that they will make, and it's not something that we can tell you about here today, unfortunately. So hopefully that clarity will come soon after the finalization of the opinions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. Roberto, you want to comment on this, or is it clear?
I think Maria said it very well, so I don't think we need to comment further.
Very good. Thank you very much. We move on to a new question. This relates to both of you, Maria, Roberto. How does ECHA assess and mitigate the risk that restriction PFAS polymer uses in biopharma manufacturing equipment could disrupt the supply of life-saving medicines in the EU, considering the strong regulatory dependencies, for example, FDA, EMA approvals, and the lack of qualified alternatives?
Okay, I think I maybe can generalize a little bit the question, because this sector is not the only one where there are potential health and safety impacts of the sector being disrupted, basically. So we have applied the same approach, and it's important to note, and I think I covered this in the presentation, that when we look at the socioeconomic impacts, we are not just talking about, impacts on profits on business, but we're talking about things that are much wider. So we consider, for instance, what are the impacts on patient safety, on different elements like this of not having not having these products available. So this is something that is considered when SEAC comes to a conclusion about whether a derogation is needed for this particular sector. And the availability of alternatives obviously is a very important part of that. If alternatives are not available, then the impacts of not being able to use PFAS is a certain impact that is different from if they were available. And when it comes also, I think the question also mentioned the fact that there are many approvals that are needed before changes are made and so on.
Yes.
That is an element that is considered in terms of what the length of the derogation is proposed. So obviously for cases where we know that even when an alternative is found, there's going to be lots of approvals that are needed, then a longer derogation period would be proposed to ensure that there is enough time to do all the things that need to be done before something is in it. This is not only the case in pharma. There's other cases, for instance, parts for airplanes and things like that, where we know that there's quite a lot of approvals and qualifications and things like that are needed. So all these things are taken into account by the analysis when we come to a final conclusion as to what we should recommend in terms of derogations.
And if I may, just to complement, of course, the analysis of alternatives is definitely in the SEAC domain. However, RAC also performed an assessment of the hazard related of the risk of the possible alternatives when this information was made available by the dossier submitters or during the consultation. And we received many inputs. And this analysis will compare basically what are the risks of continuing using PFAS versus possible alternatives that could have a risk profile that are even more severe than PFAS. So to the extent possible, this was carried out by RAC and also considered by SEAC in its final analysis.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you. I will move to a new question for both of you as well. This relates to the supply chain. It says the regulation puts start of the supply chain PFAS manufacturers into illegality if the end user, for example, the injection molder, uses the PFAS for a non-derogated application. How is that supposed to work? Does the manufacturer need to control the downstream supply chain to not produce illegal articles? Interesting question.
Yeah, I can start if you wish, Mercedes, and I'm
Yes.
sure. I think it's a very interesting question, because on one hand, if there will be derogations provided by the decision maker, PFAS will have to continue to be manufactured in Europe or imported. That's one element. There will be possibly derogated uses, and therefore these will be legally covered by the restriction. I think the question touches upon many aspects, and probably the most interesting one, at least for me, is that you need to know, you have the right to know whether you are using a mixture that contains PFAS or not to produce an article. That's why it's super important that the supply chain will transparently communicate the use of substances that could be restricted under this process. And this will allow the downstream users to understand whether their article could or not contain PFAS. The difficulty will be if such information is not provided across the supply chain. Of course, it will be extremely difficult for any economical actors to actually act. That's maybe the angle I could cover, but I'm sure Maria can also add on.
No, I can't add much more, just to say that I think we already see, and this is something that quite a few of the stakeholders have mentioned, that already just by the process of going through this restriction process, lots of information has been dug up, things that people didn't know about. So we are seeing at least some increase in that information. But yes, I think having the information is going to be crucial to be able to implement the restriction properly.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you. Now we have a question which is a bit different, and it is for you, Roberto. It refers to the scope of the restriction. The question says, is it possible to provide a complete list of restricted PFAS substances rather than by the definition? I understand by the chemical structure definition.
Well, yeah, I see the logic, because it would be easier for the economic operators to know whether the chemicals I'm using are within or not such a restriction. On the other hand, we have also to be pragmatic, and the use of the OECD definition that I've mentioned earlier might capture really several thousand of substances. So I'm not sure this would be particularly practical even for economic operators. And I think it's also if the information on the supply chain will start to circulate, it will become more clear and easier, I think, for all various sectors, whether you are within the scope or not. So the short answer is that we are not providing such a list. Of course, Commission and member states might think a bit differently, but I think the approach is to be pragmatic and to offer a definition that will be comprehensive enough to understand whether you are within the scope or not of the restriction.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Roberto. I move on to the next question related to the huge amount of information in the restriction. Here, the question is for both of you, Maria, Roberto. It says, this is a huge restriction proposal with many annexes, derogations, etc. How do you think the industry and particularly SMEs will keep track of all the derogations? Is regulation by derogation the right approach?
Yeah, indeed, it is a huge one. It's a proposal with great ambition, and we expect great impact as well, which is the good thing. Something that both SEAC and RAC, I think, have highlighted is the need for guidance here, for proper guidance to allow for both compliance but also enforcement. So I think that's where the key will come in. To have proper guidance. Yes, we understand that it is a challenge, especially for SMEs, to understand, where all the small elements of the uses will fall, and to understand whether they're derogated or not. So I think there is a need to provide more guidance when the restriction actually comes into force. Don't know if, Roberto, you want to add anything on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a general problem also, because often SMEs, they struggle with English, and our standard language is normally English, but they would also need to access this information in their own language. That's one element. I think we should also take into account that we have been quite transparent in consulting, and we receive a lot of input from many stakeholders, including SMEs. So I think their input has been very valuable. But definitely guidance, I think, will be the main issue. But there are also other multipliers. There are media outlets, there are associations, there are civil society that they can also spread the information, because the difficulty often is to reach out to SMEs. And I think the backbone of the European economy is based on SMEs, but there are so many that it's very difficult to ensure that all of them will get the right guidance. But I think we will play our role, and with also other actors, we can be effective into this.
Thank you to both of you. We move on to a new question. This relates to fluoropolymers. As concerns about fluoropolymers are limited to the manufacturing and end-of-life stage, will any possible alternatives also be assessed on manufacturing and end-of-life rather than only not being PFAS? Interesting. Alternatives about PFAS fluoropolymers. So, yeah, Roberta.
Yeah, maybe I can start. Indeed, I think we mentioned earlier in the presentation that fluoropolymers have been added, despite there have been multiple inputs from various stakeholders to question whether they should be inserted or not. And as mentioned, the concern is related to the potential release of other PFAS during their life cycle assessment or in their end of life, like disposal or incineration. So I think we mentioned earlier, we looked into the profile of the alternative, of the risk profile of alternatives. And whenever this information was available, including also in consideration of end of life, this was somewhat included. However, we were relying on the information that was made available by the dossier submitter or during the consultation. If such information was not available, of course, the committee could not make such a level of comparison, at least from the risk perspective.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Unless Maria wants to add anything.
No, I don't think there's much more that I can add to that, so that covers it.
Okay, the next one will be for Roberto. Why is the grouping approach applied to regulated products that have data, assessments, or approval, such as food contact materials, medication, or medical implants, when they clearly do not have the assumed toxic properties?
Yeah, that's a nice question that allows also me to clarify a little bit the scope, because there is often this claim that PFAS are not toxic, or at least some of them, but it depends very much on the way you interpret toxicity. As mentioned, the key concern is the very high persistency. So the moment the PFAS are released into the environment, they are so resistant to biodegradation that can stay there for a very, very long time. They can accumulate in biota. We found it on the blood of workers. There have been cases of severe pollution concentrated around, for instance, industry manufacturers of PFAS. So that's the entry point. It's correct. There are regulated products, food contact materials, pharmaceutical products, medical implants, but they tend to focus on human health. And that's the main difference. And often on those specific regulations, the environmental impact is only lightly considered, and you will find an analysis of those specific elements. So I think it's a balancing act. Of course, if you take a drug, you expect to work well and not to have negative health effects. However, you should not necessarily expect that the environmental consequences of the use of a PFAS in a drug would have been necessarily taken into account. And that's why probably there is a bit this tension between different regulations. But we try to look into it and to explicit as much as possible. And sometimes we even provided recommendations for decision maker to consider whether they should even do something into the specific downstream regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. I think we can move on to the next question related to medical devices and fluoropolymers. I think this is for you, Roberto, but of course, Maria, if you want to join in, please just do it. What do you think about the use of PFAS in medical devices? And then a statement here, mostly fluoropolymers are used.
I think it's more or less aligned with what we were mentioning. So the medical devices takes care of the safety of those products, very important products in their own specific environment. However, the environmental consequences of the use of specific chemical is not necessarily in their main focus of attention. So there are somewhat references, and this is what RAC issued. So it might well be that the use of fluoropolymers, as mentioned, works very well and does not bring any real health effects on the patient. However, there might be other PFAS that are released once you produce such a fluoropolymers, or the moment this product is then disposed. There could be incineration, and there could be the release of other PFAS. So that's the part that we looked at in the restriction, that in our view could complement very well the existing regulation from the human health perspective, like on medical devices.
Maybe what I can add there is that for all the parts of the proposal, something that the committees look at is whether the risk is sufficiently addressed by existing measures. And that is an assessment that is done for all the sectors, including those very highly regulated sectors. So that is an element that is looked at in detail as to what extent what's already there already addresses the issue. So it's something that you would find in the opinion, how the committees have assessed it.
Thank you very much, Roberto and Maria. We continue with fluoropolymers. This question is for Roberto. Fluoropolymers are recognized by RAC as non-mobile, non-bioaccumulative during their use phase. If the risk concern is about production emissions and end of life, why is the regulatory response a use restriction rather than targeted risk management measures at those specific life cycle stages?
Well, that's a very good question, and it mixes maybe two different aspects of this. So one is the decision that was made by the dossier submitters to identify a restriction as the right regulatory tool to address the PFAS concern on one end. And the other one is the assessment of the committees, and then what let's say the regulators will do. We already touched upon fluoropolymers, so we have a knowledge that there might be risk related to the end of life and disposal. And to this extent, you have to understand that RAC looks into, will the continued use of fluoropolymers increase the risk? And the short answer of the committee is yes, for the reasons that we have mentioned due to the release of PFAS, for instance, in the disposal. Could have been used risk management measures? Yes, this could have been maybe a different approach, but of course, from the risk reduction perspective, that is the angle that RAC approaches for this process, the restriction has been considered as an effective measure. I would also like to mention that we have proposed risk management measures that could also be applicable to fluoropolymers, for instance, in case, of course, a derogation would be granted to them. I think we have been clear on that. And Maria, perhaps.
No, I think that covers it. Nothing more to add on this.
Thank you very much to both of you. So we move now to a very interesting topic as well, recycling. So this is for both of you, Roberto, Maria. How does the PFAS restriction on recycled materials how does the PFAS restriction on recycled materials, as most of the recycled material available would already have PFAS? How do we handle this? So I understand we refer on how this is related to the opinions, this recycling of materials containing PFAS. Please.
Yeah, I can start maybe on that one. There is quite detailed analysis of the topic in the opinions in the more general part, because this is something that the dossier submitter has handled at a horizontal level. And there you can find analysis not about recyclable material in general, but in more detail as the different types of recycled material. So obviously the conclusions vary by type of material and reach certain different levels of certainty in terms of the conclusions. But that has been specifically analyzed, and you can find the conclusions of the committees there in the something. Yeah.
No, indeed, and I think Maria said it all. Maybe one element that RAC looked into it was also the average concentration that is expected to a specific waste stream that could be recycled. And this can vary according to the sectors, could be paper, plastic, or other sectors using PFAS. RAC also acknowledged that for economic operators and recyclers would be much easier to establish a sort of limit values above which the recycling could not take place and below which the recycling could take place. Unfortunately, We did not find enough information in the application from the dossier submitters or in the input from stakeholders in the consultation that allowed the committee to propose such a limit value. This would be probably easier to implement, but unfortunately, we could not propose such a limit value. But it's a very important point. I think we live in an economy where the circularity is becoming more and more important, and I'm really expecting Commission and member states to look into this and definitely to take this into account.
Thanks to both of you. Moving back to the 8 extra sectors, I think we have already addressed these questions, but maybe if we do it again to clarify the situation, the question reads, what is the definition of time-limited derogation for the 8 extra sectors? What time limitation is proposed?
Yeah, here when we're talking about time limited, we talk about our recommendations a little bit different from the time limited derogations that we are proposing for the other sectors there. I think I covered this in the presentation, but the dossier submitter proposed a standardized approach of 5 and 12 years for different circumstances. But what we mean here for the 8 sectors is that the derogation should be until a more specific analysis is done, which we are recommending as soon as possible. So that is what is meant there. It's not either of the 5 or the 12, but until the analysis has been done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I move back to the pharma sector, and one question that is quite similar to a previous one, but I think it will deserve a further answer to maybe clarify the topic a bit more, both for you, Maria, Roberto. SEAC denies pharma, including PFAS APIs, derogation, citing lack of emission controls, yet partially derogates some non-critical uses. Pharma is already tightly regulated by EMA, ERA, MA. Life-saving APIs are often irreplaceable. Applying standard restriction logic is inconsistent. So before, Roberto, you were explaining why the point of view from the medical regulations might not be exactly the same as the point of view from an environmental restriction. But please, if you want to address this a bit again.
Yeah, I think that's a bit the point, and we do acknowledge there are strict regulations in place that are doing their job when it goes to the safety of patients, for instance, or life-saving. Of course, they are very important articles or products. We do not question this. From a RAC perspective, we look at does the use of PFAS on those very important products create an issue in terms of increase of the risk or increasing stock of PFAS into the environment? Because let's remind that the moment PFAS are released, they stay for a very, very long time. It means that we have an issue. We know also the techniques to remediate and to remove PFAS into the environment are complicated, if they exist at all, very costly. So we are basically creating an issue for the generations to come. And that's a bit the angle that we are targeting. We do this taking into account and acknowledging that there is existing regulation, and we try to avoid any inconsistency between the two. Of course, then we are in the hands of the decision makers, and I'm also definitely looking to this from their perspective. But please, Maria.
Yeah, I think what I would like to add here is that for the derogations that the dossier submitter proposed for items like APIs, which were time and limited derogations, when we're saying that a derogation hasn't been justified, what we mean here is that there wasn't an assessment of this. The dossier submitter basically relied on the fact that they are already highly regulated, but as Roberto has explained, we consider that that doesn't address the risks of PFAS. So it's a little bit, it's not that SEAC is saying that there has been an assessment, we consider that based on this assessment there shouldn't be a derogation here. We're saying that the dossier submitted simply did not justify why there should be a derogation here because they relied on the existence of other regulation, basically. So that is the difference here, basically, in terms of the conclusions.
Thank you very much. We are moving now on to another topic that relates to uncertainties, and this is for you, Maria, related to the SEAC draft opinion. SEAC identifies numerous uncertainties in that section of the opinion. How can SEAC then confirm that the restriction is appropriate, manageable, and enforceable?
Yeah, this is a good question. I mean, what we are concluding is that a restriction with certain derogations is appropriate. And, the other things now, the question has gone, so I can't remember exactly the details. So what we're saying is that we are looking at the different areas where a derogation may be needed. And with those, we think that a restriction would be appropriate. We are also highlighting, and I think this is important, that we are not excluding that other derogations may be needed. And for that, we would need more information that we are hoping to get from the consultation. But it's a difficult one to come to very, very broad conclusions for something as big and broad. So this is the way that we have approached it and the way that we see it. We also consider that some conclusions are conditional on certain things. Like, for instance, we consider that guidance is needed, for instance, and that's links to the conclusions that we've reached on things like enforceability and so on.
Thank you very much, Maria. I'm sorry, I took out the question maybe too early, but you answered perfectly well. So now we move on to a new question also for you, Maria. How can derogations be handled for products like seals made of fluoropolymers, which are marketed via resellers? This means that there is no information available about the specific application, thousands of applications. All applications are within a wide sector of industrial uses, maintenance, and repair. So, resellers.
Yeah, so this is one of the areas where we think information would be and guidance would be particularly useful. This is, one of the kinds of situations where we think that this will be needed, because indeed, this sort of situation leads to difficulties, and I think Roberto has covered this sufficiently in the past when talking about the need for information flow and the potential consequences of that. But yes, we acknowledge the challenges that will be happening in sectors such as this.
Thank you very much, Maria. Now I will move to the next question, which is related with certified laboratories. Roberto, this is for you. Is there any... Sorry? Did you want to add something?
Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Is there any certified laboratory aiming to inspect the PFAS content of products?
Apologies, I was too eager to answer even before you were reading it. There has been a great interest of the laboratory communities on how they could help economic operators to fulfill the upcoming restriction if the decision maker will decide to go in that direction. And we have pointed out to the fact that we need to have a pragmatic approach because the number of substances is very high. And this is why the restriction has proposed limit values that are both achievable via targeted or total content of fluorine. When it goes to laboratories, we have to say that unfortunately there is not yet available analytical methodologies for all PFAS. So there is no specific certified lab to inspect PFAS necessarily. There are certified labs in general that they do perform analytical tests. And with the development and the progress, we can expect that more analytical methods will become available, and this will enlarge the possibility for laboratories to inspect and to carry out their job. So we will need, of course, guidance, and we will need a bit of patience for the laboratories to catch up in terms of tests that will allow actually to fulfill the scope of the restriction, whether you are in or not.
Thank you very much, Roberto. We move on to a new question also for you. Why for PFAS do the differences in bioaccumulation or toxicity not matter compared to other chemicals which need to be both BP and BB to be restricted? Well, BP is very persistent and BB very bioaccumulative.
Yeah, that's a quite specific question. The point is that PFAS have demonstrated a very high persistence. I think that there is definitely an agreement in the scientific community. We also know that some of them, they display quite severe toxicity, so including endocrine disrupting properties, carcinogenicity, toxicity to reproduction, or rather they can actually contribute to climate change effects, the long range transport. So there are multiplicity, so many different hazards that have been taken into account. So the entry point is that it's a very persistent set of substances. The moment they reach the environment, they stay there very long, and we keep discovering hazardous properties for many of them. So that's actually the approach that we took in place. So it was not to define, according to the CLP, the classification and labeling and packaging regulation, whether they fulfill VPVB, but it was a broader assessment that took into account the various information that I've mentioned. So I hope I have covered the question.
Yes, I think that's clear. We move on to a next question, and this is for you, Maria. We are here. We have a question. It says that I do not understand why SEAC provide the opinion no derogation needed. Pay attention, Maria, because I'm not fully sure I get the question. I do not understand why SEAC provide the opinion no derogation needed when RAC concluded for a derogation needed, as RAC did provide no derogation for some uses at all based on scientific information. Perhaps we can reflect on the differences, approaches between RAC and SEAC regarding derogations here.
I think that would be useful. I'm not sure if that is what the question is driving at, but I think both committees, each of the committee has a different remit when RAC is looking at the risks. So I think RAC will be a little bit more strict in terms of whether a derogation is needed or not, whereas SEAC does take into account the conclusions that RAC reaches, but we also take into account the socioeconomic impacts, which RAC doesn't. So it's normal that we reach different conclusions in terms of derogations, basically. This is not something where, the committees are fighting, the committees are disagreeing. It is normal. We are doing jobs that are different. That's the REACH regulation has defined, and it's defined in different way for each of the committees. So you will find many cases where SEAC is saying a derogation is likely needed, and RAC is saying, actually, we think there shouldn't be a derogation. That's going to be the majority of the cases, to be honest, where SEAC is recommending a derogation. Now, the question is talking about SEAC reaching the conclusion that no derogation is needed when RAC is saying that one is. I cannot think of particular cases there. There may be some that I'm forgetting, but I hope that this discussion of the roles of the two committees maybe helps a little bit understand the differences. I don't know, Roberto, if you want to add anything, if I misrepresented your role.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and might be a bit confusing having two committees reaching some, but we start from different starting point, and as mentioned by Maria, RAC looks into, is the derogation increasing the risk to the environment of human people? And in general, RAC could not conclude. We have just one case. I think it was the use of protective equipment or specific garments and the apparently absence of alternatives. And this could result in severe hazard for the workers that could be exposed to chemical, to fire. And in that case, RAC could counterbalance, let's say. But for other cases, RAC in general did not support derogations for the reasons Maria mentioned.
Yeah, and in cases where there are risks of the alternatives, of course, that is something that SEAC would take into account, because we look at also what the risk reduction is in terms of considering the need for a derogation. But thanks. I think that was a question that it's good to explain this as well.
Thank you very much. I am moving now to a different topic, and this relates to maintenance and spare parts. This is for you, Maria. And I am afraid that this will be the last question, because we are approaching the end of the webinar. So, how does ECHA currently view maintenance and spare part applications for long-life industrial equipment where redesign or substitution is not immediately feasible?
Yeah, I spoke earlier about recycling and explained that this is something that was dealt with horizontally by the dossier submitter. And when it comes to spare part applications, this is the case as well. So there is a whole section in the general part of the opinion that is covering this topic and providing the analysis and the conclusion. So that is, I'm not going to summarize it all here, but this is explained quite clearly both in the dossier, of course, in what we call the background document that's produced by the dossier submitter, and in the opinion, what the conclusions that SEAC had reached on this are. I think RAC also looked at this.
Thank you, Maria. They tell me we have still time for the last question. So This will go for both of you, Maria and Roberto. How long is the transition period before the ban on the use of fluoropolymers in coating systems as protection against aggressive chemicals and/or high temperature applications? So a very specific question. They refer here specifically for linings, pumps, hoses, gaskets, pipes, and other infrastructure components. Are they discussing 6.5 years or longer? So transition periods. What can you say, Maria?
Now, this is it's difficult to answer because we have a huge opinion. I think the SEAC one is about 1,000 pages, and we've got almost 200 different assessment levels. I am afraid it's going to be a very unsatisfying last question because I cannot respond to this off the top of my head, I'm afraid. Now, the information should be in the opinion. Please have a look there. We have some very handy tables where all the different derogations are listed, both the assessment of SEAC of the derogations that the dossier submitter has proposed, and also in the cases where SEAC is proposing any further derogations, and then more detailed in the sections that are sector specific of the opinion. And if after looking at that, there is still some uncertainty there because maybe it's within a larger use, something like that, then we invite you, and this I think applies, I know that we've received a few other very detailed questions. Please send the questions through our contact form on our website, because this is something that we will look into for you, not something that I want to try to remember off the top of my head and start digging into the opinion live on screen. But thanks for the question.
That's fully understand.
If I may...
We are missing you a bit, but yeah. Yes, go, Roberto. Go ahead.
No, it's just to say, I think we already mentioned, now we're coming to an end. Now SEAC has still some work to do, but the moment the opinions will be sent by the Commission, I think it's important to remind that those are the opinions of 2 independent committees where scientists and regulatory experts, they provided their own independent view. And of course, then it will start the work of member states and Commission, where they will look into this, and they might, of course, deviate or reach different conclusions. And this is a second step. But I think for now, I think it's important to mention that this has been the huge work for many people. And I think we would like both Maria and I to acknowledge the very great work that has been done by a very large number of people. And I think, I hope also our listeners appreciated this and they could indeed acknowledge this aspect. Thank you.
Indeed, lots of work being done both here in ECHA and by the members of the committees, but also by the dossier submitter. I would like to acknowledge the huge amount of work that they have done as well in putting together the proposal. So it's been a huge team effort. So yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto and Maria, for these final words. We are at the end of the webinar, indeed. So I want to thank you for joining us today and for answering the questions in such an open and illustrative way. I want to thank the audience for joining us today and for providing questions. Please, as we mentioned before, take into account that you can still submit questions if you have further questions about the restriction on our ECHA contact form. Do not hesitate to do that. And as we also mentioned before, these questions will be used to upload and update the Q&A answers on our web page. So with this, I want to say thank you to all and goodbye from Helsinki. Last reminder before I just disappear is, please, if you are interested in submitting information in the consultation, remember to do that before the 25th of May.